Viking funeral rituals, honoring warriors in death. The flames licked hungrily at the carved dragon head as the longship drifted into the fjord's embrace, carrying its fallen warrior toward Valhalla. But this iconic image, seared into our collective imagination by Hollywood and historical romance, tells only a fragment of the truth about Viking funeral practices. The reality of how these medieval Scandinavians honored their dead was far more complex, ritualistic, and, in many cases, more brutal than any modern retelling dares to show. What if I told you that the most elaborate Viking funerals involved human sacrifice, the ritual destruction of priceless possessions, and ceremonies so intricate they could last for days? The archaeological evidence reveals funeral practices that were simultaneously acts of profound love and terrifying displays of power, where the living literally paid in blood to ensure the dead reached their eternal destinations. The mythology behind the ritual. To understand Viking funeral rites, we must first grasp their cosmic significance. The Norse believed in a universe where death was not an ending but a transition, a journey fraught with peril that required careful preparation. Warriors who died gloriously in battle might ascend to Valhalla, Odin's golden hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Others might journey to Hell's realm, while some found their way to Freya's meadow, Folkvanger. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but lived realities that shaped every aspect of how the Vikings approached death. The funeral wasn't merely about saying goodbye. It was about equipping the deceased for an actual journey through dangerous realms populated by monsters, trickster spirits, and hostile forces. Every sword placed beside the body, every ship burned on the water, every sacrifice made had a practical purpose in the afterlife economy of the Norse cosmos. Ship burials, vessels for the final voyage. The most spectacular Viking funerals involved ships, but not always the floating pyres of popular imagination. Archaeological excavations have revealed that many elite Norse were buried in actual vessels, creating underground ghost ships that served as eternal transportation and status symbols. The Gokstad ship burial in Norway, dating to around 900 CE, provides a stunning example. A 76-foot oak vessel was dragged inland and placed in a specially constructed burial mound. Inside lay a powerful chieftain surrounded by weapons, jewelry, textiles, and even peacock feathers, luxury items that spoke to far-reaching trade connections. 12 horses, 6 dogs, and a peacock were sacrificed to accompany him, creating a macabre menagerie for the afterlife. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The Oseberg ship burial, perhaps the most famous Viking funeral site, contained 2 women, one elderly, one younger, along with evidence suggesting the younger woman may have been a slave sacrificed to serve her mistress in death. The ship itself was filled with intricately carved wooden artifacts, textiles of extraordinary quality, and a wooden cart that may have been used in religious ceremonies. These weren't isolated incidents. From Sweden's Vendel period graves to the ship burials of Estonia, the pattern repeats: elaborate vessels, precious grave goods, and evidence of human sacrifice intertwined in rituals that blur the line between honor and horror. The Ibn Fadlan account, eyewitness to sacrifice. The most chilling description of Viking funeral practices comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who traveled along the Volga River in 922 CE. His account of a Rus chieftain's funeral provides the only contemporary eyewitness description of these rituals, and it reads like something from a fever dream. Ibn Fadlan describes how a slave girl volunteered to die with her master, or was selected for sacrifice, depending on interpretation. Over 10 days, she was treated like royalty, given fine clothes and food, and prepared for her role in the ceremony. The ritual culminated with her death aboard the funeral ship, performed by a priestess called the Angel of Death. while male relatives of the deceased beat their shields to mask her cries. The slave girl was then placed beside her master, and the entire ship was set ablaze. Ibn Fadlan notes that a wind rose at just the right moment to fan the flames, which the Vikings interpreted as a sign that their god accepted the sacrifice. Within an hour, ship, chieftain, and slave had all been reduced to ashes. This account is both invaluable and troubling. It provides unique insight into Viking funeral practices while also revealing the human cost of these elaborate rituals. The slave girl's fate reminds us that these ceremonies, however spiritually meaningful to the participants, were built on foundations of social inequality and violence. Beyond the elite, common folk and their journey to the afterlife. While ship burials and elaborate sacrifices capture the imagination, they represented only the funeral practices of the Viking elite. Archaeological evidence reveals that ordinary Norse people developed their own meaningful ways of honoring the dead and ensuring safe passage to the afterlife. Cremation was the most common practice, often conducted on simple wooden pyres rather than elaborate ships. The burned remains might be buried in urns, scattered in meaningful locations, or interred with modest grave goods. A knife, some jewelry, perhaps a favorite tool that defined the person's life. Even these simpler burials followed ritual patterns. Bodies were often oriented in specific directions. Graves were marked with stones arranged in ship shapes, and small offerings of food or drink were left for the deceased. Women's graves tell particularly interesting stories. Female burials often contain keys, symbols of domestic authority and responsibility, along with jewelry that speaks to personal relationships and social status. Some contain weaving tools, suggesting that the ability to create textiles was valued in the afterlife. Others hold evidence of magical practices, amulets, unusual stones, or ritual items that hint at roles as healers or vulva, sorceresses. The economics of death, grave goods as social currency. Viking funerals functioned as elaborate displays of wealth, power, and social connection. The grave goods found in burial sites weren't random collections of possessions, but carefully curated ensembles that communicated specific messages about the deceased's identity, achievements, and relationships. Weapons told stories of martial prowess and social rank. A simple spearhead might accompany a farmer warrior, while elaborate swords with decorated hilts and pattern-welded blades marked professional fighters or chieftains. The quality and origin of these weapons mattered enormously. A Frankish sword or Byzantine silk textile demonstrated connections to distant lands and international trade networks. But here's what makes these funeral practices truly fascinating: the intentional destruction of wealth. Vikings didn't just bury valuable items, they often broke them, burned them, or deliberately damaged them as part of the ritual. This killing of objects was believed to transfer them to the spirit world, but it also served important social functions. By destroying rather than redistributing wealth, powerful families demonstrated their status while preventing these resources from destabilizing existing social hierarchies. The end of an era, Christianity and changing practices. The conversion to Christianity didn't immediately end Viking funeral traditions. Instead, it created a complex period of religious syncretism where Christian and pagan elements intermingled in fascinating ways. Some burials from the 10th and 11th centuries show clear Christian influence: east-west body orientation, cross pendants, reduced grave goods, while still maintaining distinctly Norse elements. The famous Jelling stones in Denmark illustrate this transition. Erected by King Harald Bluetooth around 965 CE, they commemorate his parents and proclaim his conversion of the Danes to Christianity. Yet the runestone tradition itself, the artistic style, and even some of the imagery retain deep connections to pre-Christian Norse culture. This gradual transformation reveals something profound about how cultures adapt and evolve. The Vikings didn't simply abandon their ancestral beliefs overnight. They negotiated new ways of understanding death and the afterlife that honored both their heritage and their changing spiritual landscape. Legacy of fire and honor. The Viking funeral rituals we've explored, from the grandest ship burial to the simplest cremation, reveal a culture that took death as seriously as life. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated responses to fundamental human questions about meaning, memory, and what lies beyond the grave. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new evidence about these practices, challenging our assumptions and revealing the complexity of medieval Scandinavian society. Recent discoveries include remarkably well-preserved textiles that show the incredible skill of Viking-age craftspeople, chemical analyses that reveal the geographic origins of buried individuals, and DNA studies that complicate our understanding of Viking social structures. Perhaps most importantly, these funeral rituals remind us that the Vikings were not the one-dimensional raiders of popular culture, but members of complex societies grappling with universal human experiences. In their elaborate preparations for death, we glimpse their deepest values: honor, loyalty, courage, and the profound hope that death is not the end of the story, but simply the beginning of the next chapter. The flames that consumed those longships carried more than bodies toward the horizon. They bore the dreams, fears, and aspirations of an entire civilization, leaving us with archaeological treasures and literary accounts that continue to fire our imagination more than 1,000 years later.